Great. We'll go ahead and get started here. So, hello and welcome to the Second Nature webinar on climate change research at COP26 and beyond. My name is Alex Maxwell, and I am the manager of cross-sector climate programs at Second Nature. And before I start today's webinar by introducing our speakers, I just wanted to take care of a few housekeeping items for our attendees. So first and foremost, just to make you aware, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with you via email tomorrow, which you can use to, of course, watch the webinar again and share it with any colleagues. During the webinar itself, all attendees will be muted. However, you will have the opportunity to ask questions using the questions window in the GoToWebinar platform. Questions will be collected and curated throughout the webinar and then asked of our panelists during the Q&A sessions. There will be one brief Q&A session after Mia Kett's presentation, and then for the remaining presentations, we will hold all questions and answers to the end of the webinar. Please note, you may also use the chat window, similar to what you may be familiar with on the Zoom platform, and that you can use to let us know if you're experiencing any technical difficulties during the call. And my colleague Devin, who's also on the line, will message you directly to troubleshoot any issues that you may have. So now, to introduce our panelists, today I'm excited to be joined by Mia Kett, who is the lead for science and academia engagement with the UK Cabinet Office COP unit. I'm also joined today by Tracy Bach, who's the Ringo co-focal point and visiting professor from Washington State University in St. Louis. Also from Washington University in St. Louis, we have joining us today Beth Martin, who is also a Ringo co-focal point, a teaching professor and interim director of the climate change program at WashU. And lastly, we are also joined by Alyssa Gilbert, who is the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College London. And Alyssa is also chair of UK COP26 Universities Network. So now I'd like to turn it over to Hannah, who will provide a brief introduction by UK Science and Innovation. So Hannah, feel free to take it away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to academic engagement at COP26 and beyond. It is great to have you here. I'm Hannah Davelman, and I'm part of the UK's Global Science and Innovation Network. We're thrilled to be partnering with Second Nature on this webinar, and I wanted to particularly thank Alex Maxwell for his work bringing these incredible speakers to your screens today. And of course, a huge thank you to Mia, Tracy, Beth, and Alyssa for sharing your time and knowledge with us. As I said, I'm part of the UK Science and Innovation Network. We call ourselves SIN, and we're here to help connect British and American research communities working on issues that matter to both the US and UK. In the US, our team has officers in 6 consulates and the British Embassy in Washington, which makes us one of the biggest country teams in SIN, and the size of our network here speaks to the importance of the US-UK science relationship. We work across a range of issues, but this year we're particularly excited to be discussing climate ahead of COP26, which will be held in Glasgow in November 2021. I can't wait to hear from these incredible speakers who will discuss the COP process and the UK's climate priorities. These events are made possible by viewers like you. We're always listening to British and American researchers to understand how we can help you engage internationally. And you'll see a survey later in this webinar where you can tell us about the subjects you're interested in and explore opportunities to connect with the UK. And finally, if you want to learn more about how the UK and US are working together on these issues, follow us on Twitter, either at UKSINet or UK in USA, plus all our local consulate accounts. We'll be holding lots more events on our climate priorities this year, and all the details will be there. And with that, I'll turn it over to our hosts. Thank you so much.
And
Thanks,
now
Hannah.
a few words from Second Nature President Tim Carter.
Yeah, the mysterious voice guiding us through this. So great to be with everybody. My name is Tim Carter. I'm president of Second Nature. We're really thrilled to be able to host this. We've done this, was it Beth, one other time, I think, for a couple COPs ago, and in kind of a different context. We were just kind of setting the stage for how to navigate the COP, and it's been a really great partnership. Second Nature is an organization you might not know. Our mission is to accelerate climate action in and through higher education. And the way we do that is that we actually think about the higher education sector as institutions that themselves are actors. So they, we have to decarbonize as a global economy, but institutions themselves have footprints that need to be decarbonized. So that's a really important part of what it means to take climate action as a higher ed institution and as a sector. We try to lead those efforts. We have a network of a bunch of institutions here in the US that do that. And then we also think about higher ed as an enabler of action. And I think a lot of this webinar is really focused on, as the role of the research community, how do you enable action, maybe on your own campus, but also in the rest of society? How do you shape policy? How do you create knowledge that informs what the world has to do to meet the climate goals? So both those enabling functions and acting functions, we work in both of those domains. The past, I guess since Paris, we have had a presence at the COPs, and both facilitating receptions, and then for the past few years at the US Climate Action Center. And it's worth mentioning, all of us here in the US are very excited about an incoming administration that actually will have a much more significant presence at the COP next year. And at the same time, I think what we saw over the past 4 years was that the group of subnational actors like higher ed or business, states and cities really were able to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we were still into the Paris Agreement. We wanted to really be very active, and we're taking action domestically, even while we had a federal administration that was not supportive. And so that context is going to change in a couple months, and we're really excited about that. So last thing I would say is that we actually have helped some of the UN work in anticipation of this upcoming COP in the Race to Zero campaign. And so we brought higher education into that, again, a cross-sector subnational effort to accelerate decarbonization efforts across a variety of sectors, and we brought higher education to that. So that's just some of the roles that we serve, and we're really thrilled to, again, host this webinar. And I'm going to turn it over to the mysterious voice in the sky, Alex Maxwell. Thanks, Alex.
So Beth, I will hand this over to you now.
Great, thank you, Alex. I appreciate that. So like Alex said, I'm Beth Martin, and I'm one of the Ringo co-focal points. So what does that mean? And I should say I, along with Tracy, am one of the Ringo co-focal points. So, oh, I can control my own slides. Let me go to the next slide. Oh, I thought I could control my own slides. Alex? There we go. Okay, so one of the things that we want to talk about to build on what Mia just shared is the ways in which researchers can engage in the process. And so what Tracy and I are going to focus on is more specific, that layer of the negotiations that Mia highlighted. So Tracy and I, like I said, were the co-focal points of the research and independent NGOs. One of the ways in which NGO observers are organized within the COP process is, well, they're organized into something called constituencies. So all observer organizations are put into a constituency, really an interest-based, and what the type of work their organization does. So for example, this pie chart here highlights the different constituencies within the UNFCCC. Ringo is the second largest, the largest being ENGO, which is the environmental NGOs. But you'll also see there's constituencies for business, which is BINGO, youth, YOUNGO, women and gender, trade unions, which is TUNGO, LGMA, which is local governments and municipalities, IPO, which is indigenous peoples, and farmers. So all of the observers are associated most likely with one of these constituencies. The RINGOs are all research and independent institutions like universities, think tanks, research centers. One of the things that is unique about RINGOs, separate from the other constituencies, is that we are a non-advocacy constituency. As RINGOs, what we try and do is make sure that policy and decisions are informed by science, and science broadly, from social sciences to natural sciences. And we also will speak up on process and access. Other constituencies are more agenda driven. So for example, when the gender action plan was being negotiated, the women and gender constituency was very active and vocal in trying to make sure that their interests were shared with negotiators and hopefully reflected in that final document. RINGOs also really prioritizes sharing of information. So there's our website there that's linked, and you'll find notes, meeting notes from different meetings that are there that sometimes are easier to kind of flip through somebody's notes on an event maybe than to watch an hour webcast or something along those lines. We also have a listserv and provide kind of extensive different contact and organizing information. So where we're going to kind of go for the rest of the presentation, some of the events or things that researchers may or may not, or may, I guess if you don't, then you wouldn't be watching, may want to participate in, are related to particular negotiation processes, and the access to those is through the constituency. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let me go to my next slide. So the first thing is, organizations, in order to attend a COP or a subsidiary body meeting or a constituted body meeting, need to first be admitted as observer organizations. And this is a process you go by, which there's a form you fill out, and you put all the right names in the right places. You select which constituency is most appropriate for you, and then you submit that to the UNFCCC Secretariat. Usually, it's a process that takes a little bit of time. You submit it, you'd get provisionally granted access, and then at the COP, the COP would vote to grant access to all of those who had put in applications. So we do want to highlight right now, if you're part of an organization that is not already part of an official observer organization, you're interested in more formally participating in some of the processes that Tracy and I are going to highlight and describe, then the deadline is the end of this year, December 31st, Central European Standard Time. So that's something that, if you have any questions, Tracy and I are happy to talk about those. So I believe the next slide, I will be handing it over to Tracy, who can talk a little bit more about the kind of the specific negotiation places where your research might be relevant and of assistance to parties, negotiators, and other observers as well.
Thanks, Beth. Can you all hear me? I've unmuted myself. Beautiful. So as Beth said, I am her partner, co-focal point for RINGO. I'm also a law professor who's focused on international law and international environmental law for a number of years, and in particular on this climate regime, as we like to call it. So the first step, I think, in understanding where to bring your research, again, the full gamut of research areas, is to understand a couple of different complexities. And one of them is where in the process issues are being treated. So this schema, which comes from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Secretariat, which is the administrative body that keeps the wheels running so that parties can not only negotiate, but also implement what they have agreed on. They produced this schema, which shows you, one, in the band at the top, the ultimate governance body of this treaty is called the Conference of Parties. So that's why we're here talking about COP26, which is the 26th Conference of the Parties. But parties to what? Parties to the UNFCCC. And as you all know, since that treaty entered into force in 1994, 2 more treaties have been agreed upon by mostly the same parties, but with some notable differences. And that first one would be the Kyoto Protocol, which is a protocol under the UNFCCC, and now the Paris Agreement, which is an agreement pursuant or under the UNFCCC. So I make that point because one of the things that can be challenging as you're figuring out how to insert yourself substantively from your research results that you want to see inform policy making at this level is understanding which body has jurisdiction over the issues you're interested in. So the rest of this goes down from there. So imagine a quasi-legislative body like a COP. From there, if you jump down below the Bureau, you'll see in the orange horizontal band 2 permanent subsidiary bodies. And I think of them, using a US example, as like subcommittees of Congress. And so these are 2 subcommittees or subsidiary bodies, one that's on scientific and technological advice that we all call SBSTA for the acronym, and then one that focuses on issues of implementation that we call the SBI. And most issues are processed through SBSTA and SBI, and so that's a place, takeaway number 1, to look for what you're working on. Okay, and a key piece, just so you know, they're subsidiary and they're permanent because they're mentioned in the treaties themselves. In contrast, I'm going to focus on the left-hand side of the graph, the yellow bodies, which are considered, we call them constituted bodies. And they're constituted because COPs at one of these COPs, and that's a COP of the UNFCCC or a CMP of the Kyoto Protocol, or now a CMA, a COP of the Paris Agreement, that in the decisions, they decided that they needed an ad hoc body, not that it's willy-nilly, but that it's got a shelf life that's not as permanent as the subsidiary bodies, but that focuses on specific agendas that have been brought forward by the parties. So you'll see a list of these here, and I won't go through each one, but I'll point out the first one. So Adaptation Committee. So the Adaptation Committee is a body, like these other constituted bodies, that, one, operates under a mandate that the COP, the plenary bodies, gave it in a COP decision, and regularly revises or updates, often adds to, over time. 2, it's composed of people who are members, who are parties, who are members of party delegations, who have expertise in that area. And that, again, is within the mandate because the bodies, right, the COP, wanted to have a broad geographical and socioeconomic development status representation on each of these constituted bodies. Okay, so that's the issue, and then the time frame, which is open-ended, and then who's on it. The third piece is to think about how what these adaptation committee, what these constituted bodies do. And this is what I think is key for researchers to think through about how to engage in the process. Because many people focus on the COP, the 2 weeks that hopefully will happen in Glasgow at the end of next year. But in fact, the adaptation issues that are on the agenda of SBSTA and SBI and COP and CMA are processed at the most granular level at these constituted body meetings. And that's critical. Why? Because there are open questions that are a part of their work program that they regularly reach out to experts for in the form of presenting and engaging at these meetings, also presenting and engaging in various workshops that they host, and finally, submitting written comments, which we call submissions, that are requested, usually in COP decisions, to help the body make decisions. I think that captures it. The last thing I want to point out, again, is this is a year-round effort. And so the constituted body meetings usually take place not during the COP or the intersessional meeting, which occurs usually every May or June in Bonn. So you'll keep an eye out for those, especially if you go to the Ringo website and join our listserv. You'll see regular calls for nominations on behalf of Ringo to attend these meetings, often in March and April, being one set, and then in the fall, September and October. Just briefly then, you'll see some of the other committees are covering climate finance, loss and damage, capacity building, tech issues, and then most recently on the far left, you'll see response measures, which are the concerns of countries that are currently very carbon-based response measures are the mitigation measures that are a part of this treaty process and the impact it will have on their economies, and that's what they focus on. And then finally, I guess most newest, right, if one could say that, the newest one is the LCIPP, which is the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. I'll stop there. There's other things on the schema, and happy to answer questions later. Want to go to the next slide, Beth? Thank you. All right, so those are those bodies. Now look at these agendas. So to figure out, right, where your research fits, you need to look at the agenda. And so what we're offering here are two from the last session in December. On the left, you have the COP25 session. So that's, again, the agenda of the plenary body, as well as on the right, one of the subsidiary bodies, the permanent subsidiary bodies of SUBSTA. And I want to point out a couple things. First of all, this is only the first page of those agenda. Typically, they'll have anywhere from, 16 to 21 agenda items on it. You probably ask, well, how do they get there? Because I don't see healthcare, and I don't see oceans, and I don't, the things that you care about and work on. They get there through the rules of procedure, which say basically if a party wants an item on an agenda, they can propose it. And it's proposed in advance of the meeting, and that's why when you arrive, if you notice in the italicized lettering, fourth line down, I know Beth's going to go, what? If you go down 4 lines from, let's say, COP25 session, Madrid, that adopted agenda, draft agenda are sent out about a month in advance for all these bodies. And in them, that's where parties can say, I would like to see X, Y, and Z. This is an example of an adopted agenda because then the parties convene on the first day in plenary and decide what they're really going to work on, which means there's a negotiation for the negotiation agenda because there needs to be consensus to get an item on the agenda. The second takeaway I'd love for you to see from this slide as you're figuring out how to get your research into this process, especially if you're brand new to it, is that there is interplay between that subsidiary body, just like I said, which works up like a committee structure with the COP. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see, for example, let's say agenda item 6, the Coronavia Joint Work on Agriculture. All right, do we see that? Oh, actually, I think I've picked, it's not here on that page. So I'll take a step back. Let's look at Adaptation Committee, agenda item 3. That is going to like circle with the cursor. So if you're at the SUBSTA agenda on the right, see the report of the Adaptation Committee. So one, you see it's a report, which means it's the Adaptation Committee that's been doing the work that then it's reporting on to SUBSTA. SUBSTA then has a draft recommendation that it then forwards for a COP to be part of a COP decision, which will then refine mandates and keep the work going forward on adaptation under the UNFCCC structure. Then look on the left-hand side, and you'll see that for agenda item 6 on the COP25 agenda, thank you, Beth, there's the report of the Adaptation Committee. So that's where now the full parties will decide whether or not to accept that draft recommendation from SUBSTA on the report or whether it will revise it. So fundamentally, the takeaway here is, one, you know what your issues are. So now it's wading through the complexity of the overall schema of how different parts of the system handle or treat the issues that you research, and then finding them on their individual agenda. And that will then help you figure out the next steps, which we can go to. Before we get too deep, because I did mention oceans, for example, right, and health. Those are two that, in fact, health was mentioned by Mia as one of the issues that come up in the campaign priorities. That it is not a given that just because you don't see your research area on the official agenda, that it won't get there. There's a couple of places where it can appear at a COP itself. One is in this area known as side events, which look a lot like the conferences that we're doing now, where people, researchers, experts, convene panels, really, to both convey their research and often, I think the really good ones, combine it with the actual policymakers, the negotiators who are taking up that research and showing, for example, via case studies, how this could become an effective practice that should be codified in a COP decision, for example. And I'm noting this, arc of progress here for agriculture, because agriculture is a funny thing. It's always been referenced in terms of food security in the climate regime under Article 2 of the UNFCCC. It's one of the goals, right, is not to disrupt the climate system so much that it jeopardizes food security. And so agriculture's always been there somewhere, but it's not been formally on the agenda. And again, when it's on the agenda, it has designated a negotiation time or conversation time. It has dedicated staff at the Secretariat, and it has some measure of resources and budget so as to bring in more experts and more activities on it. So the way it happened was there were enough countries that kept saying we need to have ag formally on the agenda that by 2011, that COP took the decision to actually make that a SBSTA agenda item. And then from there, SBSTA said, well, in order to learn more about it and to get more parties familiar with not just the adaptation side, which was more familiar in agricultural discussions at prior COPs and side events, we want to talk about mitigation as well. They created or called for in-session workshops and then submissions. So you see the 2013-14. That kind of, I'd say, building of a community of discourse and fact-finding led then to a COP decision to create this joint work on agriculture, which is named after a place in Fiji, the Koranibia Joint Work on Agriculture. And that is now the entity that we could see, for example, I pointed it out accidentally on the SBSTA agenda, is an area where every year there are activities to focus on both mitigation and adaptation issues. And so my point being, that place now provides a toehold for people doing research in that area, and its trajectory shows what can happen over time with other substantive issues. Next slide, Beth. So I don't mean to make Beth's eyes bulge out, because she's going to look really deeply into the screen. But the other complexity here is not just, where's my issue on an agenda and which body is governing it, but I think a real area for researchers to share their expertise in is with the parties themselves. And because there are so many dang parties to the UNFCCC, so 197 at this point, that in reality, while you could certainly approach parties and your own party in your home country with your research, in reality, parties function quite actively with their negotiation groups. So why this is complex is because there's a great degree of overlap between negotiation groups. So for example, look at the G77 in China, some 130 members, 130 some members, and you can see that they have terrific overlap with other groups. So for example, the LDCs, the Arab group, ILAC. So there are about 12 to 15 of these groups that are enmeshed in this wonderful graphic. And those entities, especially ones that are quite organized and have a measure of funding, so clearly the G77, AOSIS is one that has its own website. It also engages in other multilateral environmental agreements, ILAC, etc. You can engage with those negotiation groups as well, where your research is in line with the kinds of positions that they're looking for research to understand and deepen and support. So complexity number one is the system itself. Hopefully we've demystified that a little bit in the first three slides. Complexity number two is who your research can influence. Again, for Ringo's purpose, we're looking for evidence-based policymaking. So we try very hard to get our members as involved and as close to parties, like in those constituted body meetings, as possible. I'll leave this for here and answer any other questions, including the one that's a live one, which is what negotiating group will the UK belong to? Formerly in the EU, but no longer in that negotiating group. Next slide. Beth, do you want to take this one?
Yep. Okay, I'm back. So one of the things to also think about, and this slide is more about domestic engagement. So one of the foundations of the Paris Agreement is something called a nationally determined contribution, which, in simple terms, is a national plan for how individual countries are going to be pursuing their specific domestic ambition and mitigation and adaptation measures for some countries as well. So essentially, they're putting forward and saying, here's what we can do in our country to increase ambition and contribute to the overall goal of the Paris Agreement. So the first round of these were all put out prior to Paris being agreed upon. Candidly, I think that was part of the reason that led to Paris being successful, is that countries had indicated their willingness to participate and willingness to contribute in this way. So, but the Paris Agreement anticipated that those first round of NDCs probably weren't going to be enough. And so one of the things that is included within the Paris Agreement is this something that I like to refer to as and lots of people refer to as a ratcheting concept. And that every 5 years, countries will either put forth a new or updated NDC. So the countries are coming back to the table again saying, okay, what can we do more? What can we do more? How can we, continue to ratchet till we get to the point where we're able to meet the commitments of the Paris Agreement? That's interspersed with something called a global stocktake, which is a evaluation not of individual NDCs, but of the collective progress. So we bring this up because 2020, this year, for example, is the year at which countries have been requested to provide their newer updated NDCs. So all countries that are party to the Paris Agreement should be working on and submitting. So this NDC crafting and development is a way in which researchers can be engaged domestically. So for the US, as an example, President-elect Biden has indicated that the US will rejoin the Paris Agreement. Each country who is a party to the Paris Agreement is required to have an NDC. The agreement doesn't say what it needs to contain, but that we need to have one. So the US will be thinking and developing a new NDC. And so what that might look like, what process they might use to develop and construct it, those are all, I think, open questions. Tim, actually, if he's still on, may have a little more insight into where those discussions are going in terms of how the US will develop their NDC, when they'll submit it, if they'll submit one initially and then take a longer process to perhaps develop one with more stakeholders and submit that perhaps in the end of 2021. So I think there's a lot of open questions, but that is a place in which, in your particular country, understanding how your government is going about producing your nationally determined contribution and where there may be opportunities to engage in the development of that is also another way in which researchers can meaningfully contribute. So.
Hey, Beth, before you go off that slide, the other thing I would say to researchers too, especially if you're new to this, is that this slide beautifully points out a number of databases that you have for doing your research that are on the UNFCCC website. So for example, these national inventory reports that are mentioned, it's for NDCs, but there have been that inventories for years under the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. Greenhouse gas emissions inventories, that's another one. And then there's regular reporting as you move toward revising your NDC and the ratchet up, or that's the expression I was thinking was a virtuous spiral is the idea, that they every year or every 2 years, parties must report their progress on their NDC. The revisions every 5, and those are going to come in the form of what's called a BTR, or a biennial transparency report. So I also want to point out, and of course there's going to be output of the global stock take. So there's a lot of opportunity to get research through this process as well as to deliver it. Thanks. So shall I take the next slide?
Tracy.
Yeah,
yes,
sure. So wrapping up, and we're on time. I love it, because we really are looking forward to your questions. So one, like in that timeline that we just looked at, within each of those years, we want you to take away that there are year-round opportunities in these various meetings, workshops, and submissions. So it's not just one-offs at the COP. 2, we'd encourage you, if not to shape your research agenda, at least to see how pieces of your research agenda fit into the questions that the parties have. That's the ultimate way to engage. And again, so looking at those agenda is one way to see how the negotiating agenda has been shaped, so that then you can see how your research agenda can support it. The other thing I'd like to offer is working with other NGOs and IGOs who are experienced. If you're new to this, you'll find that there are plenty of out there who have a similar research focus, and that you could plug your research into. I mentioned those workshops and other mandated mandated events that really rely on experts to inform. And we didn't make a big deal of it, but the opportunity to make written submissions is a great way to take pieces of your research products, right, your results, and see the questions that the COP decisions have asked for submissions on, and then apply it in that scenario. They're written, they're often the starting point for negotiations, both the party submissions as well as the observer submissions. And then finally, I make that pitch for attending the constituted body meetings, because that's really, in my opinion, where the rubber meets the road. Briefly, at COPs and SBs, and on the last slide, we're going to encourage you to go to that Second Nature webinar that Ringo did a few years ago that Tim mentioned. But at these big events like COPs and subsidiary body meetings, the intersessional meeting, there are side events. And so that's the classic way that researchers tend to get involved, presenting at side events, doing exhibits, poster presentations, being involved in various country pavilions. There's also this idea of a green zone, and those are for folks who don't have the badges within a delegation, and there's similar kinds of opportunities. The other thing I don't want to get lost here is, while we focus on the UNFCCC, we need to keep in mind how was mentioned earlier, I think Mia mentioned it, that the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, has quite a few climate change impact issues as a part of that agenda. China is the chair or the president this year. The Ozone Convention, of course, has a direct corollary. And the SDGs, in particular, the high-level political forums, are opportunities for your research to have influence. And then, of course, the classic IPCC for the researchers, both in hard and soft sciences, and then on finance, Jeff and GCF. And then, as Beth said, you have an opportunity to continue to work domestically, to have your research contribute to your NDCs, your country's NDCs. Thanks, Beth.
All right, so I'll take this one quickly. This is just a couple of highlights and links that you'll be able to go to access information. One thing I do want to add is, in our new virtual world, many of the constituted body meetings have been being live streamed. So like we said, in order to actively engage, you need to go through observer constituencies. But a benefit of kind of the virtual world is that anyone, whether you're an official observer or not, can go to most of these constituted body web pages and actually watch a live stream of what is happening as kind of a fly on the wall of what's going on in the room. And so I think that can be really valuable. Also, starting on the 23rd, there are a set of November dialogues. And those will be doing the same way. So if there's agenda items that you're interested in, but you're not an observer, or you didn't get one of the 2 slots that they're allowing to attend, you're still able to watch those virtually, and not just virtually in real time, but virtually on demand through the UNFCCC website. So that is something that, out of necessity, has been amplified this year, and can be beneficial. So I just wanted to make sure that we shared that as well. So we will stop and turn it over, I think, to Alyssa.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Tracy. And as Beth just mentioned, we're now going to hand it over to Alyssa. And if I could just ask that Devin please share the links that Beth and Mia mentioned. The links Mia mentioned are in your email, and the link that Beth provided is in the chat. So we'll make sure those get out to attendees. But now handing it over to Alyssa.
Okay, great. Thanks, Beth and Tracy, for setting that up so nicely with the international context. So now I just wanted to speak to you all about a sort of grassroots initiative that's taken place in the UK in preparation of the UK's presidency of COP26. So at the moment, I'm chairing a group called the COP26 Universities Network, and this is basically a grassroots organization that's grown up, now representing 52 universities, and also in addition to that, several research, nationally funded research organizations and institutes in the UK, which is quite a significant proportion of the UK's universities, as there's a smaller number of UK universities than there are US universities. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our network and what we're aiming to do, and then consider towards the end how we might be able to forge links with US academics and maybe do some things together that achieve some of those evidence-based advocacy goals or aims that Beth and Tracy were referring to when they talked about the different routes through during or around the COP26 process. I'm now just trying, there we go, I did it, okay. So what are the goals of the group? So as I said, we're a kind of a grassroots organization. We started to get together when it looked like the UK might have the COP presidency. So around September last year, September 2019. And at the time, we thought that was going to be a presidency for an event that was taking place this week. For better or for worse, probably, yeah, mixed feelings. For a worse reason, but giving us more time to have impact. We now have an extra year to galvanize our forces. And we really have three kinds of goals in the group. The overarching one is to ensure that the UK academic sector and universities play the role, the best role that we can in delivering a successful COP26, but also action beyond that. In the UK, we have very strong academic actors across all of the different parts of the natural to social sciences. And those scientists and academics across the piece feel very strongly and passionately about using their knowledge to really impact change. And this is seen as an opportunity by people. So we've got a lot of really enthusiastic members. What we want to do is make sure that it's really easy for the COP26 presidency. So that's people like Mia, who's on the call, but also other parts of the UK civil service, including people like Hannah, who's also on the call, the Science and Innovation Network, to really access the evidence that they need to lead COP26 successfully. But also we want to be able to share that information with other actors. And then, of course, we want to make sure that within our own sphere of influence, so on our own campuses and through our work with students and through education, we are also getting everyone, all the players on track to deliver a low carbon resilient world. So within the group, the way that we're structured, it's quite a loose, sort of informal, soft governance structure. We do have a steering group, and I'm the chair, and we do make decisions in a structured process. But what we also do have is different work streams or activities. And for each of these activities, we have a volunteer at one of our universities leading it. So the first activity that we're doing is one that focuses on sharing knowledge. Would first manifest itself in, I guess, a kind of a traditional way of doing this, which is writing targeted and strategic briefing notes. At the moment, we have about 15, presenting evidence on key issues that are relevant to COP, and particularly those that speak to the negotiation priorities that Tracy alluded to, or priorities surrounding that. So, for example, we published the first paper on COVID recovery, a green COVID recovery and COVID response, and the second one we published is on a just transition. And we've got a few more coming, for example, one on the importance of net zero, long-term net zero targets. Now, some of those aspects are captured directly in negotiations, but some of them are not. But they're an important backdrop either to the diplomacy for success or a surrounding part of the conversation that we think is important. We're deliberately focusing these papers on issues that we think as an independent group need to be shouted about and shared in advance of COP26. And so for the most part, they do align with those campaign priorities that Mia mentioned, but they are not about those campaign priorities because we're independent of the UK government in what we're saying. But all of these papers are written by a group of authors across different universities, are endorsed by all of the university members, and so it will go out with the logos and the amplification and communication power of, at the moment, all 52 members. We're also sharing our knowledge by providing training and outreach to different people who might need it, such as those people delivering COP civil services and the civil service, but speaking to people at different events. And that includes sometimes speaking to groups of people within our own member universities who need to learn more, and offering our support to Mia and the other people in the COP26 university team access to experts, particularly when they want a focused look at some of the particular subjects that they're working on. And we're actually specifically doing that for some members of the Foreign Office. So for example, your colleagues of Hannah's in Singapore are looking to bring together UK academic experts together with Singaporean experts on some key issues in the run-up to COP in that region of the world. And we're helping build the bridges to the right people to make that happen. We're also trying to make sure that we share with international colleagues. This is part of this conversation. But we're also working with complementary partners in the UK, not just universities, and we're working closely to share evidence with other international partners as well. We're having specific roundtable events with some of Mia's colleagues in different parts of the UK government and so on. So when we write these papers, they don't just sit there, but we're making sure that we're sharing the information directly with the people who need to know it. And then we are linking up with similar networks of universities or evidence givers that we can find in other parts of the globe. And there are lots of them in all different kinds of groupings. So trying to make sure that we're joining up in that regard as well. We've started and kicked off working with Mia again, but also others from across UK government to work on the education and skills priorities for delivering a net zero resilient UK, but also much of that work would speak to other parts of the world as well. And in that regard, we're playing two roles. We're playing a role as representatives of the higher education sector. So what do we deliver as part of that? But also we're playing a role in terms of providing the evidence that we can give about how important this is, what kinds of scales of skills we'll need in different sectors to help make that journey. We are also running an innovation strand, and that innovation strand, who just had their first meeting this week, are going to deliver an innovation showcase, planning at the moment to deliver it in COP physically, if that's possible at the end of next year. And that showcase may also be linked to a Green Careers Fair. So we're joining up the education and skills part with the innovation part. This innovation part will probably be in partnership with some private sector actors. They've just kicked that off now, but it's very likely that we'll see some sponsorship and also representation from the private sector there. We really want to showcase what universities can bring to that important agenda. We are also leading some strands of work on public engagement. So within our network, amongst the experts, we have people who are really seasoned and experienced experts in the social sciences and expertise around climate change communications itself. And we're going to publish some best practice guidelines for our institutions on public events related to COP26. And hopefully that will lead to us having a series of public events across all of our campuses in line with COP26 so that we're reaching all different parts of British society. It's certainly in location-wise, we can manage that through our university network. And as part of the public engagement piece, it looks like we're going to be training at least one person from each of the different universities that are currently represented so that they're able to deliver public engagement in the best possible way. I wanted to highlight this particular activity. We're planning to deliver a virtual conference in spring 2021. And the idea of this virtual conference is to share evidence for policymaking in a sort of time frame that leads into COP, with a nice lead time to create conversation between academics and policymakers around the world, and to also act as a form of diplomacy in the run-up to the events in November 2021. We're currently planning the conference, and where we've got to so far is agreement that there are probably going to be 3 streams of audience: students being one, academics as another, and policymakers as another. And we expect to have 1 week's worth of activities. Each of the 5 days will be a different theme. Those themes will be similar to, but not exactly the same as, the campaigns that Mia told you about. And we expect that each of those days will be top and tailed with sort of science policy interface conversations, hopefully with some representation from some of the COP26 presidency key actors. But we do hope that there will be an international dimension, and we intend to invite international representatives from those different groups, students, academics, and policymakers, as relevant to each of those subject matters. It's going to be a fully digital event, and we're brainstorming right now about all different kinds of innovative ways that we can engage with our audiences and get people involved. But it will involve a combination, as I've got there, of things like poster sessions, pre-recorded talks, panel discussions, and so on. And we hope to keep that information that we gather in the digital sphere open and provide more regular engagement between that period in spring 2021 and November 2021 as well. And so we hope that's a contribution that we can really make from the academic sector to COP, and then of course after that. Here's a list of some of the priority issues that we identified at the beginning of our journey as a universities network. And we're writing papers on some of these and continuing to iterate a little bit on these. I already mentioned that we've done something on COVID recovery and we've done something on just transitions, but you can expect to see more from us on long-term net zero goals, the importance of adaptation and resilience in a high ambition story. We've written a letter to the Prime Minister together about the need for a highly ambitious NBC, at least from the UK, and we expect to hear something, not us personally, but everyone from the Prime Minister this week, although he's just gone into self-isolation, so let's see who tells us that. And there'll be a paper on climate finance, a paper on nature-based solutions, and the interaction of biodiversity with climate change goals, which speaks to what Tracy said about the importance of the Conference of Biological Diversity happening next year as well. So quite a lot of priorities on our side, but we don't want to go beyond and into everyone's smaller pet issues. We want it to really be focused on these strategic issues. So I wanted to sort of finish on some ideas of what is it that you could do. We're really keen to use this also as a jumping off point to create links between UK academics and, in this case, US academics, but also academics elsewhere relevant in the world. That's also because we're conscious that for the evidence that we are all gathering to have an impact both on the diplomatic processes at hand, but also on the longer term goals of creating a net zero resilient world, we need to all be linked up and we need to make things really relevant to your national context. And the spokespeople for that evidence ought to be local people, depending who you want to speak to. But it would be really nice to be joined up. Of course, some ideas here through our network, and we now have a website, which I think there's a link to in this presentation on the second slide. We can help you find UK experts or academics working in the sector on whichever area you're interested in. You could either look at our website, there's a searchable expert database, but it's obviously not everybody. So you can also just reach out to me and we can find the right people. We can also give you that way more information about ongoing projects, either our overarching kind of evidence related projects, but also the specific research projects that people are working on. It's also a chance for you to share information about your work with specialized academics if you want to share that with people in the UK because you think it's relevant to our context or this broader COP agenda. Please let us know and we can create opportunities for that. But also it's a chance to share your experiences on evidence-based policy with other people who are trying to do it. And most importantly, we really do want to create some international momentum on key issues. So it's nice for us to think about how we can do that together. We're happy to attend or invite some of you to our events and other sort of outreach on climate related research and so on, but also very open to any of your suggestions. So just there to really collaborate. As an example, which I mentioned before, in Singapore, they're currently, the Singapore FC Foreign Office representative for the UK identified 3 key issues that are relevant in the climate agenda to Singapore. And for each of those issues, we're helping them find UK academics to work on a joint project with a Singapore academic to draft a short paper to influence those agendas in that location and make the best use of joint evidence finding. And that's a kind of nice, clear way that we could work together. Here's a list of the universities that are members so far, in case anyone wants to look up for a specific one. You can look at it later. But what I should say is it's our goal to be as inclusive as possible. So you should be able to see there some of what in the UK are very old established universities, but also some newer universities. And everyone's getting involved in a way that's most relevant both to their research and to what's on their agenda at the moment as well. Here's some contacts. You can contact me. Also, Stephen Davidson, who's there, is the lead for the international collaboration at Cambridge. And my colleague Ria is happy to field quick responses or help you find people if necessary. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Alyssa, and thank you again, Beth, Tracy, and Mia, for your presentations here. while you were speaking, we had several folks chime in with questions here. One of the common questions we get is, will these slides or will this presentation be available after? And for those of you that asked that question, yes, it will. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, in a follow-up email, there will be a link to the recording, which is usually posted the day after on our Second Nature website. So don't worry, you will get those resources as well, because I know there are a lot of wonderful links and websites shared as well. Now, I did see a couple of questions come in just in the question window here. This one's actually directed to you, Beth. So how does one join and register their organization for COP26? And this is a question coming from someone in Kenya.
So I put, yeah, okay, I'm just checking that my mute is off. I put a link that I believe Devin shared that'll take you to the UNFCCC website, where you'll see that diagram that I included on the slide, and it outlines the process. But essentially, there's a form that you'll have to fill out from your form, and whoever kind of is the chief of the organization, you'll have to get the right signatures, and then you'll need to submit that to the UNFCCC by the end of the year. So that link should take you to the right web page to get you started.
Great, thanks, Beth. Alyssa, this one's directed to you, but I can certainly open it up to Beth and Tracy as well, because I think you have experience with this. But Alyssa, you did touch on some opportunities for students, especially as they relate to the network you were speaking to. But I'm just curious the extent to which you have seen student researchers, maybe at the graduate or the postdoc level, be involved in getting their research translated into policy discussions as part of COP. Would love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've tried, and we've been very open to, for these papers and for the other activities we're doing, getting earlier career researchers involved, including students where that's appropriate. And in quite a few cases, some of these papers, the people who are leading on the papers have brought in their students to help participate in the writing of that. In general, the papers that we're writing are quite broad in scope, so none of them would reflect one single individual area of research, and often people's specific areas of research, like you might have as the scope for your PhD, are reflected in a few sentences of a bigger paper. But certainly students are getting involved in that way, mostly in that case through their supervisors or their direct research groups. In addition, we've had quite a lot of interest from students across different places who are just really keen to somehow be involved in COP, particularly in the UK, when they see that the presidency is coming and they think this is really my chance at a lifetime to really do something. But it's very hard to steer them towards exactly what that chance will be. And we don't want it to just be that they're kind of volunteering to show foreign visitors the way to the COP bus or something like that, which no doubt there'll be some of that. So that's why I think at the moment we're just trying to let them know that they come and speak to us. Many of the students are very self-organizing, so we also don't feel like it's our role to organize it on their behalf. There's some very large initiatives being led by students, including several different mock COP activities that are taking place mostly now, and a few that will take place next year. A very, very large student energy summit that's completely student-led again. And for those activities, they've approached us sometimes to have some academic support to help them get it right. And I think that's really, really great. So we want to just be there kind of to be supportive. We're trying also to create links between students. So where we see that there's student organizing groups in different universities, connecting them with each other. But we are hoping that in two areas, we might get students really actively involved. One is the conference, and that's why we specifically decided that we wanted a stream of activity for students. And the other is hopefully through the public engagement activities. And that if we do want to have public engagement activities on many different campuses, that's going to have to be supported by a lot of different people. And this is not just a case of pointing people to buses. This is really skilled activity. Doing climate change communications for the public well is really difficult. And so that's also hopefully skill building. So those are the kind of areas that we've thought about so far.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. Beth, Tracy, anything to add there, especially with your past experience?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in, and I think Tracy probably will as well. So another way, kind of, I guess, maybe that students have been engaged in COPs is through their observer organizations. Many institutions will allocate. So once you become an observer organization, it doesn't mean that everybody gets to go. It just means that you get to get in line for a limited number of spaces of those then that get to go. Some institutions will allocate their quota to students. So for example, my institution, I teach a class on the negotiations. Our badges go to the students who are in my class. So all organizations make different decisions as to how those badges are allocated. As Ringos, though, we do see a fair number of researchers who attend, or young researchers, or doctoral candidates, or recent PhDs who are attending, and they get actively engaged in the Ringo constituency. And we've really worked hard to try to provide a home for them, both as a way. We've had a Young Ringo booth at various COPs where young researchers could have a place to share their research and help amplify some of the work that they're doing. Also, when we have opportunities to allocate space and slot to different constituency meetings, we, as a steering committee for Ringo, we will pay attention to both being able to enable new or young researchers or graduate students to participate, as well as some, for example, if we can send 5 to a meeting on, say, the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage, we would look for a balance of both young researchers as well as more experienced researchers who could attend kind of as a group and both be able to attend and contribute, but also learn from one another. So just to say that if you're a doctoral student or a young researcher, Ringo is a great place to try to be engaged, because there is what's the word I'm looking for? There's a great depth of people who are working on different issues throughout Ringo. And that can be a way to find. We've seen our groups be like, oh no, like we're the ones that go to this meeting together, and we've seen connections build across institutions and across countries based on the topics that different people are focusing on.
That's
So,
great.
Tracy?
Tracy, anything to add there?
Well, there's not too much left to add, except I'll give just one example. When Beth said how we consciously think about sharing opportunities with young Ringos, younger researchers. I can recall one of those the Kajawa, the Koronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, where we're very fortunate that that's an area of really robust research. And we very consciously promoted a more seasoned researcher professor for one of the expertise workshops, and very consciously nominated a younger PhD student to present at the other. So we do that quite consciously. The other thing I'd say is by plugging young Ringos into a number of these meetings that happen throughout the year, which enhances their expertise it may not be exactly pertinent to their PhD, but gives them that deeper background. We have started what Beth, I'd say in the last 2 COPs, using some portion of our coordinating meeting every morning to feature particular topics. And again, it's been an opportunity for those younger members to have the microphone, be on the stage, and lead some discussion. So building capacity within Ringo.
That's great. Thanks, Tracy, for adding that. And we also dropped a few resources as well in the chat window for those of you following along. Some really nice references there provided by Beth and Hannah. So please feel free to check those out, including a call for papers as well that was recently released.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please, Beth.
One of the resources I popped in, and I did this is because I also want to call your attention to the youth constituency. Many young adults and youth attend COP under the auspices of the youth constituency, and it may be something that is of interest to your students. The youth tend to be much more advocacy oriented. And we've had students from, university students may attach themselves or be able to get a badge through a youth NGO that's a part of the youth constituency. And so they do a lot of good work advocating really specifically on issues that, are relevant to youth, which is really almost all the issues that that are under discussion at COP. But I did just want to draw your attention to that distinction. It's a more advocacy-oriented work than the research focus that we have, but there could be students that's a great way for them to engage.
Great, thanks, Beth. Another question we had, I guess, Alyssa, this goes back to something you mentioned in the list of priority issues, this idea of just transitions and how that is being planned for. Could you maybe elaborate on how that's making its way into your list of priority issues? And then I would say, even Mia, if you're on the call as well, maybe talking about it in relation to your work, or Hannah. But Alyssa, would you mind just unpacking that a bit?
Yeah, so I think from a starting point, we wrote a paper on this issue because I think it's quite live in the research field. This discussion about, well, basically, we recognize that the solution to the climate change challenge ahead is a pretty rapid transition to this net zero resilient world, but there's a couple of clear directions where there's a big risk of that transition itself not being fair or equitable. And it's very important that while we're advocating an improvement that's going to be to the net benefit of everybody in the world, that averaging or net effect is going to hide some pretty serious impacts for some communities and also some individuals. For example, those individuals who already work in very fossil fuel heavy parts of the economy. And that can even go as far as affecting one or two countries quite specifically, but certainly can affect other regions, and there's secondary effects. So if you have some communities that are quite heavily dependent on what are quite carbon polluting activities, they also support a whole community of other businesses that may not be, but are definitely part of the local economy. So a whole sort of a thinking about the stages of the transition that are planned that take into account creating new jobs or replacement jobs, reskilling people in the middle of their career, and creating also the right environment for that transition is really, really important. And we know that that's something that in the UK we haven't got right in the past. So the transition away from coal was quite damaging to some UK communities in the past already. But there are also parts of the world that have demonstrated how you can do this well and thoughtfully. And there's some good case studies, for example, in Germany, and in other smaller communities where they're really starting to think about that. So that's one part of it. The other area where the transition could also risk not being very just is where the policies put in place are regressive. So they may impact some people, and particularly poorer people, more than other people. For example, taxes on fuels that may affect transport decisions differently in rural and urban environments where people don't have the same choices. So raising this now is really important, because if we're shouting to the whole world that we need action on climate change now, we don't want to be in a position 10 years from now where people say, you told us to do this, and look at all these people whose lives are worse. So we want to try and do it best possible way. So that's the main point. The agenda item in the paper that we've written is all about integrating these decisions, learning from best practice, about this challenge of a rapid transition, and making sure that we're doing it thoughtfully and getting it right. And we're conscious that that affects different people in different parts of the world really differently. So that's also where partnership with different within the UK, even within our network, we're conscious that we need different universities in different parts of the UK to speak about this, because it's relevant to cultures and existing communities quite a lot. But again, it's also very relevant to the international agenda.
Great, thank you, Alyssa. One other question we had come in the question box here, and this was touched on very, very early on. This comment is around the interplay between COVID recovery and funding, and kind of moving towards a climate-friendly COVID recovery, if you will. And so I guess the question is the extent to which you are seeing COVID maybe interact with discussions around funding for sort of new job creation, green investment, and ultimately this move towards a prioritization of a low or zero carbon recovery. Does anybody have any comments there? I know Mia kindly spoke to it at the beginning, and I don't think she's on the line with us anymore, but I guess Tracy, Beth, or Alyssa, anything on how you're seeing kind of COVID interplay with the negotiations and how you're kind of strategically positioning yourselves thus far.
I can jump in to kick us off. Certainly in the time that many of us have been working like this, basically March, April, May, there have been a number of panels, conferences about the recovery from the pandemic, and not only the pandemic's impact on climate change and emissions, but in reverse, how to restart our economies without accelerating greenhouse gas emissions. So build back better, I think, is what President-elect Biden would say. So the OECD has a model platform. The EU has offered also its ideas for packages. So the idea would be, nationally, right? National government economic recovery packages that, for example, focus on building renewable energy in places, changing transmission lines, for example, which is a key requirement in developed countries to transmit wind and solar energy on. That's not, the existing line doesn't do as efficiently. Those big infrastructure projects, which would, on one hand, employ a lot of people, two, if done well, could provide skills that facilitate that just transition, as Alyssa so beautifully described. And then third, of course, decrease our carbon footprint. So I would look at a number of different sources that's certainly being discussed. And Beth mentioned earlier that right now in the footprint of what would have been Glasgow, the COP26, we're having these November climate change dialogues, and there are panels on the intersection of COVID recovery and climate change. For example, I'm attending one that has a number of case studies that they're looking at. Now, of course, those would be in their infancy, but it's a very live discussion.
Great. Yeah, Tracy, I appreciate you mentioning those panels in particular there. Beth, Alyssa, anything to add?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in also. I mean, there's always been loads of discussion about this topic, as Tracy said, from all different kinds of angles. There's also been a couple of really interesting pieces of research that have come out that I think we should note. One of them was some research being done analyzing the recovery packages from around the world and saying, okay, well, how green are they? Basically, spoiler alert, not. Not very. And actually, that's really worrying, because this is really an unprecedented injection of public money. We know that that what we need is any investment that's made now, every investment that's made now, has to be on the path to this zero carbon resilient world. We can't afford for those investments to not be in the right place now. And that includes for countries that have development priorities, because it's not really fair for their populations to have jobs that are created that are basically redundant or not good for the environment, because that's something that, we shouldn't assume those people don't care about as well. They want high quality, kind of sustainable jobs as well. So that's something to worry about. Tracy, pointed out the front runners there. The EU is like the front runner in their package, and we're hopefully about to see the US become the front runner too. And there are others who, when they were a bit named and shamed, actually changed their approaches. So that's showing that it's really worth unpicking it and talking about it, because it's not sort of tenable for those countries to come out with long-term net zero targets and then be building, fossil fuel generated power plants right now. So I think it does give us a chance to also use that transparency to make some very strong and important points right now. Another sort of bit of research that came out that one of my colleagues produced a few weeks ago was a comparison between the scale of these public investments in COVID recovery and the scale of annual investment that we need to make to follow the commitments that people have made as part of their Paris Agreement commitments. And so you can hear a rhetoric from people who are interested in climate action saying that it's too expensive to take action on climate. But if you look at them compared, the kind of investment that you need in the clean energy sector, for example, is tiny compared to the commitments made as COVID recovery. So those are the kind of points that are important. And sharing academic advice or creating new academic evidence now about this can have a really important impact at an important juncture.
Well, thank you, Tracy and Alyssa. And I know we have just a few minutes left, so I'll ask maybe this final question, and then maybe just provide a brief wrap up with mention, of course, of the survey that will be going out to all attendees here. I think this goes back to maybe Beth and Tracy here with the wonderful visualizations that you had that showed the number of different entry points for researchers to become engaged in the negotiations. And I think this question was mainly out of interest, kind of in your own experience. What was your first entry point into the COP negotiations? And bearing in mind that there are many, but I think folks are kind of curious to hear kind of how you first got involved. So maybe I'll pitch it to you, Beth, since we haven't heard from you in a little bit, and then maybe Tracy, if you want to go, and Alyssa, if you have anything to add.
So I actually kind of laugh a little bit because really my entry point into this world was through my students. The students, and someone had asked, how did you get observer status? Our undergraduate students decided about 10 years ago that this was important and they wanted to be engaged, period. So they got together, they filled out the forms, they got the chancellor to sign it and submitted them. And the next thing we knew, we were observers. And then what they found was that they wanted an educational component for their observation to help them better understand. They went for a year or two and just wanted to learn more about it so they could put context to their observations a lot more, at which point they brought me in. So my introduction really was through them. And I think it's a great testimonial to what students can do when they put their mind to it and how they can push institutions to go and address things. So they brought me in. I met Tracy, who was also there with some of her students, and we started working together. I think I can speak for both of us to say that we found a home in Ringo with a group of tremendous mentors and people that were willing to help guide us and introduce us to this complexity, and found a space that we were able to learn and grow in. So really, and like I said, I'm a teaching professor, so that's teaching is my role. So I got in through my teaching and not necessarily through research. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Oh, thanks, Beth.
So I can add that, like Beth, I focus quite a bit on teaching, and but teaching in law school and bringing law students to the COPs gave me an opportunity to do what lawyers do all the time, which is have clients. And so I created a service learning partnership with a least developed country delegation, in part because at my first COP, which was before Beth and I met, the moment you sit down in a coffee and it says professor in front of your name, you get quite a few delegates who want to ask you questions, especially when they find out that you're a law professor. So one of the opportunities I had is to essentially shape my students' academic work, certainly the output, in terms of, once gotten up to speed, advising this LDC delegation, prepping them for the negotiations on the issues they cared most about, expanding their reach at the negotiations by attending sessions that their small size couldn't enable, taking notes, and then briefing them throughout. And through that process, a couple things have happened. One is I've become an advisor to that country, and I'm currently watching their NDC be revised, which is, and I say watching because we're in very different time zones, so I don't get to attend as many meetings as I might like. But second, I ended up, even though I don't really see myself as a researcher, I've written about this kind of applied learning and took it the next step because I really am working on capacity building. So I have made submissions, a submission to the PCCB, the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, and taken that next step. And that was so that is one of my entries into it. So those are multiple.
Right.
Well, thanks for highlighting those examples.
Yeah, like Tracy both said, like we'd like to focus that our students are engaged in the negotiations and that they're having a product. So even though I'm with undergraduates and not quite ready to do advising, they take extensive notes and we share those notes from what they're able to attend through our website and the constituency, so that their work is also their educational output rather hopefully serves a broader audience and has a broader impact.
That's great. I know we're a little over time, but any final comments from our panelists, Alyssa or Hannah?
No, but we'd love to hear from you and engage and work with you. That's my message.
Great, great. Well,
We're happy to facilitate and help make connections.
And last but not least, I still haven't gotten an answer to my question about negotiating group for the UK. So I'd love to hear offline what people are thinking.
Well, great. Well, I guess we will wrap it up here. There's certainly plenty of opportunity for follow-up. So I just wanted to thank our speakers again and all of our attendees. Just as another gentle reminder, a recording of this webinar will be posted online tomorrow, and you will receive a link to it in a follow-up email, along with a survey, a very brief survey related to the webinar, ways to continue the conversation here. And should you have any additional need for information, please feel free to reach out to me at amaxwell@secondnature.org. And many thanks, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.